Welcome to the 34th episode of the Perfectly Imperfect Spiritual Podcast. My today's guest, Katie Cercone, Orna, is an artist, astrologer, yogi priestess, and spiritual gangsta hailing from the Blessed Coast, a pioneer of hip hop, yoga, committed to the contemporary sacred arts and the rise of the divine femme. Orna has led sacred arts rituals in venues throughout the US, UK, and Asia. Her work has been featured in Dazed, Milk, Interview, Japan Times, Huffington Post, Art 21, Hyperallergic, Paper, Art Fag City, Washington Post, and Art Net TV, among others. Cercone is adjunct faculty at the School of Visual Arts, where she teaches gender trouble in the Visual and Critical Studies department. Katie's most recent body of work involves an in-depth visual study of feminine planet Venus and the outer lying feminist asteroids. Since 2022, she's presented her Feminist Cosmos study as Astromemes, Unsewn, Astrofeminist, Pillow Pictures, and Performative, Socially Engaged Venus RX pop-up astro oracles throughout New York City. Welcome, Katie, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited about this conversation, and we'll see where it takes us. I've mentioned just before we started recording the podcast that I pulled some cards from Abiola Abrams' deck, African Goddess Rising. And well, wow, Katie. Well, I'm not surprised, but you're such a multifaceted woman, and there's so many angles we could approach this conversation. And I know your work spans art, astrology, spirituality, sacred embodiment, and feminist activism. But I would love to start by asking about your heroine's journey. How did you really step into your fullness, reclaim your sacred self, and really liberated yourself from restrictive external expectations and norms? Because the first card that I've got here that jump out is live out loud. This really tells me about the importance of us speaking about really becoming authentic and truthful to ourselves. I'm very curious about that. And then we've got the alchemy card, which really tells me about being able to alchemize any obstacles, any challenging things that do happen in our life. And how have you allowed yourself to shine so brightly now?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, it's very much a cyclical journey. And, I have a lot of Scorpio placements, so I definitely identify with this process of regeneration and I understand the heroine's journey is one of descent and involves a lot of shadow work, whether that's the shadows, of our own psychological makeup that we're not quite aware of, but also ancestral shadows and kind of like dealing with inherited um things from my family line and also, ways that I've sort of experienced empowerment, but through maybe a misconstrued lens, or, I'm constantly kind of refining and pausing and hitting roadblocks as much as I've really lived out loud, and I think sometimes I have trouble really speaking to that in a powerful way because I always feel like I'm in the deep crucible of transformation and have gone, especially in the recent 5 years, have gone through a lot of things that I would experience as crisis and collective crisis really, and then my own personal kind of falling away of a lot of the things that were meaningful. And I think that's when we're able to really refine who we are and rise and come back stronger, even from like the first point, I thought of in my journey was having a serious eating disorder when I was really began like 9 years old, and then kind of traveled with me into college. But through that, I really started to crystallize a kind of life purpose that has evolved quite a bit, but kind of came from that place of turning against myself, or, recognizing in a way that the culture I was living in was kind of engineered at my expense, or I was shouldering this burden of a gender identity that wasn't necessarily fitting, as well as, the other intersections there of race and class and, how that influenced for me, kind of having a disordered relationship to food that was also evident of my lack of belonging, really in connection to the earth, really impacted a lot of my ability to have healthy relationships or see myself, positively. But I think that first moment where I kind of was experiencing recovery, in a profound way, that's when I really was like, I want to help other women. I felt inspired by some of the kind of counselor, therapists, role models that came into my life at that point. Others I was like really enraged by, and I still feel like I deal with a lot of anger, um, as well as sadness, especially now. But, that's kind of been a part of the cycle. And I think the same time, it's kind of where I got pushed past the point of seeing myself as a singular entity and kind of really wanting to do something that was more service oriented, or kind of having been in such a dark place, finding the will to kind of reshape the world and help others, even if my understanding of what that might look like has changed quite a bit.
Hmm. Beautiful. And what advice would you give to grown-up women, but also to mothers? This is what keeps coming for me as well. My daughter will be 9 in April. Being a parent is such a huge responsibility, and I haven't experienced that with my son to that degree, but with my daughter recently, we've been on holiday, and my daughter announced that she has to go on diet because she overheard that another mother shamed her daughter, saying that she's fat. She spoke to an 8-year-old, uh, which is like so shocking because I think at this age it starts, and as parents we have that responsibility and we should do something in order to not cause more like harm. And of course we can't protect our children and seal them in a bubble, but it's shocking how early, especially girls, are exposed to that diet culture. So I'm wondering what advice would you give to other mothers, but then like young women as well, how they can really accept themselves for who they are and really not take on so much of the external expectations or anything that women feel that they should do, or how they should change their bodies, or how they, yeah.
Yeah, it really is troubling. And I know that the being the mother of a female child, I've heard, is actually much harder because it kind of triggers the wounds of the feminine lineage. And I think it's complex because sometimes it's like I feel like my mother told me the right thing, right? Which is don't diet, you're perfect as you are. She
Mm,
actually was don't wear makeup, you're beautiful, um, but what I did was not what she said. I copied what she did, which was diet
mm,
and,
mm,
make yourself small. And, you know, so it's like I was kind of given a mixed message, I felt, as well as really influenced by reading teen magazines. So part of my journey in that was really powerful and kind of the beginning of becoming a creator, because ultimately I identify as an artist, and I think that's my sort of mode of resistance that sort of at least is an umbrella that can encompass all of the things I do, right? So I started making zines where I was, rather than, taking in all of this media, which is essentially, commissioned by advertisers to sell us products through fear. They're teaching us we're not good enough. Now I think it's really scary that it's not just like my understanding of body dysmorphia is that, right, you feel fat or you're afraid of being fat or you can't see, right, how you actually are. But now it's like another level where there's so much pressure to get plastic surgery and body modification, because what we're seeing in celebrity culture and even what we're seeing behind closed doors, a lot of parents enforcing standard of this is the way a nose should look if you want to get a job. So I think there's so many layers. For me, there was an aspect of depression, an anxiety disorder. I personally actually took myself off birth control and antidepressants and was like, I'm gonna do this the batshit crazy, holistic way. And I'm really happy that I did that, speaking as a yogi and someone who really just wants to be present and in touch with my emotions and kind of looking at the root of problems. So I think one way I've really found peace with food and my body, and even with my relationships with others, I think food is symbolic of love, and it was something, having an eating disorder, that actually really alienated me and isolated me from a lot of others who were family or friends or support system. So I think that, something that is really simple that really helped me was really just enjoying your food. I do believe in eating healthy, and of course, processed food and sugar, these things are addictive, and they're problems in themselves. But I also just found that, this idea of the diet in itself really sets us up for failure, where we're taking something away, we're not allowing ourselves to have it, and then we're kind of going to excess later because we've created this thing that is sort of elevated as forbidden fruit. So I really learned to only eat foods that are really delicious and, like, you know, cook with a lot of coconut oil or nut butters or things that, like, I really find, my satisfies my body but tastes good, and kind of indulgences, whereas like always allowing yourself that pleasure and connection to your food rather than treating it like this kind of um, surgical procedure where every calorie count. And it's really like you're living in your head and you're living in fear, right? Which is how we've been driven to operate, out of fear, out of shame. That's how, we've been controlled, and why we've sort of submitted to this system that, white male patriarchy or whatever we want to call it, that's, right, really disempowering for women. That's kind of taking our agency away. And I think women have a tremendous amount of, creative sexual energy that we can put to the use of really evolving society and the system. And I think it's like it really begins around kind of claiming that healthy feminine essence. And I think it's like slowing down, chewing our food, cooking our food, you know, eating really well, but eating mindfully, like whatever it is that we really are sort of, we can fetishize our food, especially when we're going through cycles of deprivation. So it's like, have a little bit of the thing you're really craving and really truly enjoy it and allow yourself that. And then, find the balance. Also, for me, having a daily yoga practice, it shows me kind of what I can get away with and what I can't. And, not only all the food I'm eating, but the media the things I'm reading, the things I'm watching, the environments, like I'm sort of taking all of that in and it's showing up in my practice. So, I think that's really helped me refine my diet so that it's, providing me with a higher quality of life while also kind of keeping that balance and allowing myself pleasure and to have a really mindful, juicy experience with food, to have a healthy relationship with food and my body. It's been a really slow process, if I would say that I've been free of my eating disorder for about 20 years, but at least for a good 10 or 15, I was really deep in it. And it is a mental disease.
The sexual energy. And one of the other, you'll not be surprised, but the other card that I pulled is sacred lust. And then we've
Mm.
got desire. So I feel like perhaps you would be willing to talk a little bit about how you help women to fully embody their divine feminine power, and maybe as an example, how you've stepped into that power, how you've become that unapologetic woman.
Yeah. Well, it's looked different along the journey, but I really found like when I was younger, and especially when I was kind of coming out of this eating disorder, I noticed that I had a lot of suppressed anger and resentment, and also that I was very disembodied, and that in my mind, I actually was aspiring to be this kind of like vixen, seductress, like empowered sexual woman. But that in reality, I was like almost like frigid and just so sort of disconnected and very in my mind, but not really truly in my body. So I think for me, I started a feminist collective and we really identified as being a sex positive feminist collective and started looking at all of these images of goddess worship and how, the temple, the holiest of holies is really the yoni and the feminine sacred space and the Kundalini Shakti energy. There's so many beautiful metaphors for the female anatomy, and it's so limited and misunderstood, particularly in the West, right? Where we kind of went from total repression to like porn mecca. But I think they're both sort of equally disenfranchising for women. And I sort of say all that to say, I think earlier versions of me reclaiming embodiment and sort of accessing this part of me that has lust and passion, in some ways kind of parodied or mimicked toxic masculinity, almost unconsciously, or that's what I perceive. Like, I want to be an alpha femme. I want to be a female player. I want to beat men at their own game. Like, from a young age, I was very much like assessing the culture and the power dynamics and sort of saying, I can do this too, and kind of stumbling because at the end of the day, I'm more nerdy, intellectual, kind of feminist. But it's almost like I've grown so much that it's like I forget, like, I'm kind of cool now. Like, I'm almost at a point, like, now reclaiming my sexuality has been like a year of, or 3 years plus of like celibacy. And, I think that for me, I, you spoke to like the heroine's journey, and I understand that the heroine's journey is this like we often have this desperate need for love, right? As women, like we're looking for our soulmate. We're looking for the love of, you know, female friends and the mother and the father we never had, but the real, culmination of that journey is self-love. And I think
Mm.
even as I kind of put aside the neuroses with the eating disorder, there were ways that I could play that out, kind of seeking love in escapist ways and, having like romance after romance or being love drunk and kind of like drowning in the other. And yes, experiencing a lot of deep connection and growth and, like no regrets. But I also just kind of had to realize, where that was getting me, like constantly sort of seeking outside of myself for validation or feeling like I would finally arrive, once I had the partner or the boyfriend or, the daughter that I want to have that I'm bringing in. And I think I've really had to slow down a lot and kind of get in touch with some deeper faculties and look at the ways that, maybe seeking love was a distraction from my deeper purpose, or that I got so, wrapped up in other people's worlds that I lost myself, and I'm trying to kind of come back and find that center. And, as an artist, I think a lot of artists don't have kids, and one reason, right, is our creative energy and our sexual energy is one and the same. Not to say that we can't do both, but that
Mhm.
it does take a tremendous amount of energy to grow and nurture a life and then to, let it go out into the world. And I think there's ways that we can also squander that energy in all the wrong places. And, pleasure is isn't necessarily a means to an end in itself. We have to really keep elevating, this desire for pleasure. And even if we think about the second chakra, it means sweetness. And it is about, following our bliss and crystallizing our desire, recognizing that we must become conscious of this feeling of lust, right? That churns the world, that really motivates people to take action, whether they know it or not. So much of the world, right, boils down to, power, sex, money, right? They're all sort of conflated in this twisted way. So I think it's like recognizing that and still finding a way to honor it as sacred. And I think sometimes it's for women, it's actually more about boundaries and saying no, right? Because we can become so flattered or romanced by something that's really our own fantasy and maybe this kind of idealized version of love and connection, and we haven't taken the time to really clarify what it is for ourselves is our bottom line, and what, are we willing to give, and what are our expectations, and then asking, this is what I need, right? This is what it's worth for me to connect with this person in a certain way, and I think sometimes, as painful as it is, we have to go into a kind of therapeutic solitude, to kind of realign. And so it's like, as much as I really in the past have been like this, sexuality on blast, and really that was helpful for me to kind of come out of the closet and
Mhm.
have a lot of lovers. And, that was not something that was part of my experience when I was younger or in high school. I felt sort of lonely often, but I think cycling back, I really want to refine how I use that energy. And I really am kind of on this track of having another child. I want to bring back sacred marriage, and I believe in sex magic, and, want to just encourage people to really work with this energy in conscious, healthy, aligned ways.
So beautiful. So many questions keep coming to my mind. Well, I would like to start from self-love because it's everything. It's so important. Simple, there's nothing simple here, but simple ways how you can start finding that self-love within, because I know, and you've already talked, like we're living under that sex negative patriarchal system, and we're like our bodies are demonized, and there's like so much shame and fear, and so how can we really try and mute that and
Mm.
concentrate on ourselves and tap into that unconditional love?
Yeah. Well, I think mute is definitely a good word, and I found that, I think when I was younger, I was really kind of into being a creator rather than a consumer, right? So I've always been pretty good about not reading mainstream news, not being too romanced by, Hollywood films or trying to keep up with the Joneses. Like I've been pretty good about doing my own thing. I think my daily yoga practice is something I don't talk enough about or haven't always figured out the most helpful way to share it with people, because it's easy to say and yet it's something that's really saved my life. And, some days it's all restorative. It's literally me lying on a bolster or putting my legs up the wall, working with the breath. I emphasize with my students, like, if you do anything for this next 60 minutes, just breathe. Remember how to breathe, right? This is
Mm,
about sitting with yourself, or I like this
mm,
metaphor of the midwife, right? Of like when I had my first child, I decided to have a home birth with a midwife because a midwife really sits with you and compassionately witnesses you. She allows you to bring life through, right? She helps you release the blocks that are stopping you. Whereas Western medicine takes a much more invasive approach, right? And it has a lot of things, bells and whistles, and ways that it can kind of complicate birth, and then create more opportunities to sell to you. Or, often a lot of women get C-sections, and I think that's unfortunate, and I feel like having that sense of what my solar center is in my body, what its purpose is, right? I think so many women come at it from this place of like fear. Like, I'm worried that I'm going to gain weight during pregnancy, or I'm worried that my partner isn't going to like my armpit hair, and like for me, it's it's you know, it's okay if we've had some of those views, right? We've been kind of brainwashed. I see this meme going around like people pleasing is over, be unbearable, and I think in many ways I have been like bold and unapologetic, and I've just like broken the chain of violence. In other ways, I've had to really take a step back and look, no matter what we do, we can perpetuate a sort of violence, unconsciously, right? We can always evolve and go higher and do better. And I think recently, a lot of it for me has been trying to connect to my feminine energy in more simple ways, like I first wanted to say, daily yoga practice, daily meditation, right? That discipline, that's almost my masculine energy that's like, this works, do it.
mhm,
You've done this at 13 years old, but I've noticed like in my 30s and kind of after, this last relationship where I was single and kind of like looking for a new partner, but want to do things really differently, I've been more connected to my feminine energy in the sense of kind of receiving, being more receptive, not trying to control and will things into reality. And also finding simple rituals around like beauty that are meaningful to me, right? Understanding that I think like the younger me was so like this warrior, like smashing the beauty myth and like coming out of my eating disorder, I was just like very anti makeup and just in a way like anti this kind of female artifice, right? I didn't like that I was supposed to look a certain way, and when I do, I'm rewarded and everyone likes me. And when I don't, it's like I'm an ogre that's a threat to society, right? So I feel like I've refined that to a place where like I'm actually working for a beauty magazine and writing their astrology
Mm,
column, and I do a lot of facials, and I get access to a lot of like really expensive natural beauty products. And I found that just the act of like massaging my face, with like a botanical cleanser. And like I've just developed these like very, things that I probably as an artist and someone who's had a really, lived kind of below poverty level for several years, I wouldn't necessarily have access to these things or even, have thought to spend money on them. But I've noticed just the act of like focusing on self-care in that way, and especially all of these kind of products that are chemical free and that are
mm,
made essential oils, like that's a really good one that's like a little bit less free from, right, the beauty myth. Just things that allow us to slow down and feel at home in the body, or bare feet in the grass. Like I also think about my North Node in Taurus, which is ruled by Venus, and it's the earth aspect of Venus. So it is kind of that mother that's very sexual, very sensual, and likes pleasure, right? But it doesn't have to be my kind of bulimic pleasure, coma that was like swinging between poles of ecstasy and agony, but this kind of more soft, subtle, refined, embodied, smelling the roses. That's a good one. Like stopping to smell the roses, like giving yourself permission to rest, to really acknowledge what it is the body is telling you. There's so many ways that we can practice mindfulness. It doesn't have to be yoga, it doesn't have to be aromatherapy, but these are some ways that I think I've connected to that feminine essence in a way that I didn't understand when I was in my 20s. Didn't really connect to in the some way, or maybe I understood on a certain intellectual level, but then have didn't really catch up in terms of the dailiness of that sort of mode of existing in your feminine energy and allowing yourself that space to be receptive, right? To be still and at peace.
mm. Beautiful. And as you kept elaborating, I kept hearing my spirit guides um, mentioning those three words, slow down, go with the flow, you are the flow. So that's just so beautiful how you've described that. Um, well, the ability that I want to talk about like every woman, but of course no matter what our gender is, we all have divine feminine and masculine energy, but that divine feminine energy is very soft. It's very slow, very flowy. So you articulated it beautifully. I could feel the energy. You've mentioned about the yoga and the importance of daily rituals. Can we talk about hip hop yoga? Because I've got two cards. Well, one is the soul forgiveness, and you've already well touched a little bit about that. But there's a soul forgiveness, and then I do have the harvest card, and somehow this card reminded me about the importance of community and then hip hop. So I'm wondering, what have you learned from the hip hop community, from the hip hop music in general, and how have you become that precursor of like combining that hip hop yoga?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And definitely, hip hop has had such a tremendous influence on my life. I feel like I said to someone the other day, like, I just can't believe how much it's sort of, impacted the trajectory of my career and it's really been like a spiritual practice for me, and that awakening. And it's definitely a process of education, and I still feel like in many ways, because I do so many things, that I'm a student, of all of these disciplines, and there's always more to learn about yoga. There's always more to learn about hip hop. A lot of times our understanding of these things is very limited, right? Because, hip hop is not kind of the rap that we often see on the radio, or, I grew up on the West Coast and kind of, lived in the suburbs. And I, currently talk about my family as white passing, being Italian, although I very much just grew up understanding we're white people and that's how my family identifies, but through my journey of learning about, the reality of race and racism and the invention, right, of white supremacy, I've also liked to, reflect on how my ancestors were not white and that the Irish were colonized by the British and Europe colonized itself, right? And Italians and Irish came to America as immigrants, right? As our president is like deporting all the immigrants, and sort of championing white supremacy. It's like on the one hand, I very much have white privilege and come into hip hop, you know, as a white person, right, as someone who's sort of inherently suspect and an outsider, and sort of thirsty for this spiritual medicine that, I understand is coming from the source of all religion, right? The roots, just like the matrifocal source is Africa, and we are all Black and we're all African at the same time, particularly in the US, right? We're living a racial turf war, and it's very, if whether it seems so or not, it's segregated in a lot of parts of this country, and it's very much interwoven with class, right? And so I think hip hop, is a folk art that started in the Bronx. And, being in New York, I've had the privilege to really participate and learn with some of the founding fathers of hip hop and be in the cipher, and help to create more spaces. In my past, I was co-directing an urban mystery school, and the kind of center hip hop yoga is at the center of that. And for me, that began with my thesis at SVA as an art student. I fell in love with Lil Wayne and his music, and, just went on this deep dive, going to as many rap shows, reading all the books by Black academics. That's actually how I came to know about Abiola Abrams, as I interviewed her about this, opera kind of show she had done involving hip hop and, Afro mythology. And so, for me, it's helped me kind of connect to something that's primordial, right? I think, I like to use this example of like in a lot of African dialects and in all of them, right? There's no separation between music and dance, right? It's like you hear the sound and you move. It moves through you, and I think for me, hip hop is about a cipher and it's about everyone sharing and participating as an equal. It's about call and response. It's about being embodied and live and walking the earth as a god and a goddess, and I rap, I do hip hop yoga performances at a kind of local art gallery in the East Village, and I also find it's very complex and I kind of get a lot of flack for cultural appropriation, even if, my intentions are, I've just found that like when I initially was like hip hop and yoga are really similar. I think that was like the lightning bolt for me is like looking at goddess pose, right? Which is a
Mm.
yogic asana. It's basically the kind of formula of African dance, right? It's the sort of basic archetype of goddess worship throughout the world, right? Which goes back to this like Mother Africa. We all come from one Black woman, so I think yoga is just as all the religions of the world sort of trickle down from that understanding, and everything has been appropriated from the Jesus story to the Bible to the Quran. I think for me, hip hop has global appeal because it's really kind of channeling the sacred medicine of embodiment and collectivity and the circle of life, and allows us to connect to the part of us that is still nature, that is still animal, while also having an intellect and the heart wisdom, and so I've kind of been on this journey. I wrote my thesis on hip hop and, then was leading hip hop yoga retreats in Thailand and kind of giving others permission to learn about it and grow and experiment. But it's been such a whole long, complex journey, and depending on the space, I sometimes feel more or less kind of authorized to be a leader in that way. But it's definitely something that has really influenced me in a profound way and has, I think, really activated my throat chakra too. I take it for granted sometimes, even if it's been really challenging and um I've crashed and burned many times on my journey as an artist and a creator. I think that moment that I found my voice and it was like, this is not about being a coat hanger for some corporation or signing an album deal. This is not about being an influencer. This is not about getting laid or being the best bitch, this is like me being authentic. This is me remembering that we all should sing and dance and laugh every day, right? And I think a lot of our understanding of hip hop is really removed from the original values of the founding members, just as yoga and anything, even feminism, it gets watered down, it gets diluted. And I in no way mean to contribute to that, as much as my understanding is still limited to my personal context and the people that have shared these tools with me and, authorized me and encouraged me to rap, but I find that it's just such a good outlet for my rage and libido where like I just go to town, I rap and it feels good and I write my own lyrics and I do it with my son. He's a hip hop yoga baby and is like keeping me freestyling, and I think that it's something a lot of women are really, if not consciously, unconsciously, holding back from really letting their authentic voice out and speaking their truth. You know, one of the big aspects of hip hop is speaking truth to power, right?
Mm. I love it. And I kept hearing two things from my guides as you were speaking. Well, first, I was so much connected to your throat chakra. Do you think it's almost like our human and spiritual responsibility to tap into our truth, authentic self? Because I work with so many women, not only women, who are really holding themselves back. And it's frequently the throat chakra that gets restricted. And as you were like explaining how freely, like how we are fully into hip hop and then yoga, I could feel that energy, like the sexual energy, the creatrix energy in you, like rising. And I kept hearing then you're a master manifester, as I feel like you're then like so much tapped into the source energy. So I'm just wondering whether you can comment on that, anything that you'd like about like the importance of being authentic and really allowing the world to hear your truth.
Yeah. You know, I think I feel like it might be hard to even for a lot of people that know my work or have seen my different iterations is like even when I was a performance artist before I really started kind of formally working with hip hop yoga as a tool, as a functional kind of wellness tool, I was kind of this unhinged feminist performance artist that was like, especially with this podcast, it was like so imperfectly perfect. It was like nothing was planned. The whole thing was just, we accidentally became this feminist collective and started traveling the world, just being like, it was sort of like this emotional outward bound of like, we are so angry and fed up, and we're just like willing to go off the chain as this like force of expression, you know? And I think for me with rap, I was able to kind of like just sort of like channel that through something that's a little bit more, you know, I feel like as much as the spontaneity and the like explosive emotions was really freeing, I also found that it was, you know, it's very easy for you to kind of lose sight of the deeper intention, or the work can kind of like spiral out. So I now feel like the words that I put into my rhymes, right, are spells. So it's like I usually like to write a song when I'm like, something is shifting or something is coming through. It is a process, as you said, of manifestation, you know, and I feel like I have had a lot of times in my life where I'm rapid manifestation is this kind of magic is flowing through me. And, you know, with that comes a lot of issues and things we didn't expect, right? Because it's one thing to just have the dream, and then it's another to really
Mm.
like, okay, we're standing in the shoes of yourself, and now we're dealing with like all these crazy problems, right? Because each manifestation comes into the world, and we're also not quite to deal with the consequences of like, I'm not going to naively say that you can build something with good intentions, but then it's also like, okay, now we're in the real world and things are complex, so we're going to deal with what we created, right? And there's always like a good and a negative side, and that's why we keep refining and growing. But I find it's like for me writing a rap, and then later I'll be totally having a bad day and just be like so over it, you know, and it's like my own words that I created, whether I'm practicing for a performance or just kind of doing it as a nice daily release or a kind of wake up call. It's like it really reminds me what was my deeper intention, you know. And some songs are more like, I need to express my anger. I need to say what I couldn't say to that gallerist or to that person that I feel like played me or lied to me or, was out of integrity. And it can be an outlet for me to just absolve some sort of negative experience as much as it is, a place for me to really channel my voice. And with yoga, we say that sound never dies, right? So every word, every utterance travels out into infinity, as same goes for our thoughts, but I think words, even are that much more potent. And we think of the root chakra as like a wand of manifestation. I'm also really big proponent of mantra. And that's something that, I use in my yoga practice daily. And it's also something that with hip hop and yoga, I've done songs where I'm either teaching the audience a mantra or working with the sacred mantra as the chorus. I changed my name to Parvati Slice on Instagram because for 2 years I've been working with the Parvati mantra, who is the goddess of yoga and the wife of Lord Shiva. And that came to be through this song I created called Parvati Slice, where the chorus was the Parvati mantra, which is a mantra about sacred marriage and both cultivating that sacred union and also attracting your divine consort, your divine masculine, as a reflection, right, of that inner wholeness, right? Attracting another person that's whole in their masculine and feminine energy, because it's both a reality, right, as well as a symbolic reality of, just as you said, our internal energy of the balance of masculine and feminine, right? We play out those archetypes through our gender, through our sexual identity, but we also first want to really, make the foundation that inner marriage. So that's Parvati and Shiva. To me, first and foremost, it's that inner marriage, right? So every morning when I chant that mantra, I'm cultivating and feeding that inner marriage. And then, yeah, my art practice of that, is a little bit more campy and a little bit more sexy and kind of burlesque and, allows me to kind of have that outlet for my creative sexual energy in a way that, feels resonant with my generation, and yet also with this kind of ancient primordial feminine wisdom that really honors this sacredness of sexuality and the sacred union.
Mm, beautiful. I'm aware of the time, so I'll just ask only two more questions. We could speak here for like hours. I'm like, oh, like, okay. Yeah, I will be going off track because it's perfectly imperfect. But so anyone who has never done any yoga or has definitely not done any hip hop yoga, would you say that that practice, hip hop yoga or yoga separately, has allowed you really to step into your own sovereignty, and has it allowed you really to reclaim your personal power and truth? I'm just curious about whether those practices can allow people to, well, reclaim or find their own sense of wholeness.
Mm. I definitely think so. I grew up singing. My mother was a professional singer before she became, well, she was a nurse that became a professional singer and then a sound healer, and now she's more of a coach and mentor. But I grew up singing, and it was really my first love, and especially choral singing. So, like, just to me, singing is such a beautiful experience. Or, I like this phrase saying, singing fills the belly with chi, right? With prana. Just as mantra in yogic practice is the fastest way to open the heart, and I think I also love music. I love listening to music. I fell in love with hip hop at a young age and then, later revisited it as a scholar, as a feminist. as someone that, often I think part of my intrigue with hip hop too was that it was seemingly antithetical to feminism or seemingly antithetical to wellness and yoga. And yet the deeper I looked, well, that's not the case, right? They're actually, there's so many interconnections, and we're really getting the toxicity of the music industry, right? Or the corporatization, the profitization of a lot of these practices, whether yoga or hip hop, when we start to see more the negative implications, right? And of course, we could talk about that forever. But I think, having done like the moon circles, where we're really inviting people, sometimes people who, have been in ciphers or make their own music, and sometimes people who are literally like, oh my God, I'm terrified at the thought of public speaking, right? And
Mhm.
often they're women, you know, um, even I remember when I was younger and just writing my thesis on hip hop and making friends with any rapper I knew, right? I remember kind of being in a cipher and just like really wanting to rap, and like nothing came out. That was my first experience, and it reminds me of being a young girl in middle school and being very self-conscious, and like, my crush is talking to me and like I can't say anything.
Mhm.
And there's just this a block for me there. And certainly I've heard that from my mother. That's kind of like been such a big part of her work. It's unlocking women's authentic voices. And I feel like
Mhm.
because hip hop has been a part of my generation, whether we acknowledge it or not, like culture in America, art in America is Black culture. Like it has been, fed to us commercially. It has been fed to us on the radio. It has been fed to us in fashion, and I think really getting close to people who are doing conscious hip hop and are in connection with, the five elements, the fifth being knowledge of self in community, right? I've just been able to learn so much about, my position, my having white privilege, having pretty privilege, and also the ways in which, I've really limited myself by playing this role of the daughter of patriarchy and kind of being the sweet, I think what I kind of got off on a tangent somewhere, but I just feel like I was really conditioned to be a very pleasant, sweet, accommodating, smiley white girl. And deep down, I'm like a raging ball of fire that's like really lusty and, you know, kind of like could be an evil dictator if I went down the wrong path. And yet, hip hop has been this outlet for me to kind of, in a healthy way that also feels real, right? That also is, you know, just embodied, and also working with my imagination and my intellect and my hopes and dreams, right? Every time I express with my voice, or even I haven't even talked a lot about the dance. And, in my performance practice, I've kind of created a hybrid movement where I'll do a little bit of yoga, but then it will kind of feed into something that's more, I'm not a trained dancer. And in many ways, I'm just kind of like responding to nightlife and other performance artists, as well as things I've seen in the media and things that are circulating in the popular culture. I've just created this practice, which for me is also about breaking down people's expectations of like, I can be a mother, I can be a
Mhm.
spiritual person, I can also twerk and swear. This doesn't mean that I'm necessarily I don't know. I want to break down those barriers of like high and low culture, black and white, right? I think they're much murkier than we think. And I like kind of pushing the limit of people's expectations. And, it's definitely been challenging. And I constantly, need to kind of revitalize and refine what I'm doing depending on, the audience or getting different feedback, right, is also really telling of like, why we trigger people or why certain people don't like what we're doing, whereas other people find it really meaningful and important for that same reason, and I think often the people that really need us most are also can be the people that trigger us because they're kind of the less healed version of ourselves, So I think even if I'm just showing other women how to access that authentic speech and, maybe mess up a little bit and get it wrong and be loud and be dramatic, I think that's who I am in my essence. And I haven't found a lot of spaces where I can be that fully other than art.
Hmm. I love it. And one last question, and then of course I'll want you to share how people can work with you. And I know you've got so many projects, and we'll include all of the links, but I have to ask you, you've only mentioned a little bit about your Feminist Cosmos project, which is such a beautiful fusion of astrology, art, activism. So are you able to tell a little bit more about how Venus and those feminist asteroids play a role in both personal and collective transformation? Maybe tie it to like a message that you would like to leave the viewers and listeners with.
Yeah. Well, I think interesting that my journey into astrology really came at like a breaking point and a very much like a moment of kind of during the pandemic. I was leading moon gatherings on the new and full moon, and often we would invite astrologers, and I was listening to a lot of astrologers, for several years prior to this, but during the pandemic, I felt like this kind of moment of just kind of losing everything. A lot of the collaborators I had worked with were moving away, and relationships shift and change, and I was suddenly a single mother, and felt just that I couldn't rely on the same communities that I had felt that sense of belonging with, and was really feeling isolated and alone, and turned to astrology, kind of looking for love, I think looking for self-love, but also kind of looking for to kind of recreate some of the golden era of, I've done a lot of my best work in partnership, either with friends or lovers, and I also was kind of dealing with the aftermath of that. So I turned to astrology as a lens to heal myself, and it's been so amazing. And just, again, there's always overlap with the different modalities, whether hip hop or yoga. There's always correspondences, and I feel like I need them all. But certainly what I talked about, like returning to my feminine energy and really honoring that rather than kind of buying into the culture that privileges masculinity or that privileges asserting yourself and being toxic and being the alpha and being the player. I've found that with my North Node in Taurus, my soul growth actually occurs through a lot of what I described as like this moving towards peace, moving towards the garden, moving towards slowness and stillness. And, a lot of my trauma is in Scorpio, which is like crisis and regeneration and kind of, the lower aspects of Scorpio get really dark and dramatic. And, I feel like I've gotten really stuck, and astrology has helped me pull myself out of that, and it's like really just a passion. Like, I find that I often want to spend the weekends like waking up at 3:30 doing my yoga practice and then writing about the feminist asteroids and studying them and making memes. And like, it's really healing me to understand, essentially, I would describe Western astrology as privileging rapists and battle mongers and power over and demoting the feminine to brides and wives, right? And sidekicks, neutered, weakened, two-dimensional, stereotypical feminine sidekicks. This is what we get in a lot of these surface level astrology. But the asteroids and a kind of deeper dive into Venus and even Scorpio is feminine. It's female Mars. So I definitely identify with this kind of female Mars in the sense of like the feminine warrior that is a voice of regeneration and change and transmutation is coming up from the underworld like a pressure cooked diamond. It's the energy of the Buddha. And I feel like it weaves together everything I'm interested in, from like the word witchery with the rapping to the psychology. Originally, I went to college to be a psychologist and help women heal from eating disorders, but I found that like page one of the psychology text, there was so much sexism that I just shut the book and became a women's studies major. And yet astrology is kind of bringing me back to that, but from this more creative, imaginative place where we can rethink myths and stories, right, that we're living out in our daily life, often to our detriment. But, what I'm interested in is the astrofeminists that are like, this has always been here. We've been ignoring all these really complex female archetypes where we are creators and we're also destroyers, and if we don't honor that time for grief, letting go, all the miscarriages and the postpartum periods and the fallow cycles, then we're also really, prohibiting ourselves from that full power cycle of generation and creation and creativity. I think, again, it's like that cycle and really going through every aspect of it with your eyes open is so important to all of these practices. That wisdom is kind of laced through them all. But I just love astrology because I love words. I've always been a writer, and it's something that helps me to order my reality and really move in a healthier direction.
Thank you. And finally, how can people work with you? Could you share some of the projects? I know it's not possible to share everything.
Yeah, well, I will just say two things. Like for those people living in New York City, I teach a weekly community yoga class at Urban Asanas in Crown Heights. And it's a sliding scale class every Monday at 9:30 a.m. That's your Hatha Vinyasa accessible wellness practice. And I like to share astro insights as well. And my other offerings are on my Instagram at Parvati Instagram or Parvati_slice. I do offer individual natal readings. I offer couples readings, which is one of my favorite things, looking at the lovers synastry and the composite chart. And I also do Venus readings, which can be just a kind of focus look at your Venus placement and all the aspects. So that's something I can do with people anywhere in the world. It's a session by Zoom. You also get a long written report. And for me, that's what kind of is my main area of passion right now, is just bringing people these kind of a different approach to astrology that really is feminist and is radical and is, the asteroids kind of are ushering in this quantum leap in consciousness that's allowing us to elevate out of the old systems of dominate and control, right? Because we can all perpetuate those and are all in some ways, right, still coming out of that dark ages. I want everyone to claim the part of them that, they're projecting out onto the enemy or onto, evil in the world. It's like, I think once we really resolve that within ourselves, that's when we can stand up and be the truth and find that wholeness, right? There is no perfect path. There is no, you know, action that's free of negative consequences. But yeah, I like to work with people one on one because I feel like that's where the most growth happens. And so for me, doing the Astro Oracle, that's the best way I would say right now to really work on me if you want to look at your own personal cosmic destiny written in the stars.
Mhm. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Katie. This was such an empowering conversation. I am really grateful for you agreeing to come to the podcast.
Thank you,
And
Marta.
yeah, thank you. And I just want to say thank you to all of the viewers and listeners. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Yes, goodbye. Peace.